Hello, and thanks for watching Office Hours. My name is Christian Buckley. I'm a Microsoft MVP and Regional Director and the Microsoft Go-to-Market Director for AvePoint. And we are live streaming today via LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And we broadcast on the first and third Wednesdays of each month. My guest today is Erica Toelle. Hey, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but just to give some props to Erica, a former Office Apps and Services MVP. She just threw it all away, But she's now a senior product marketing manager for records management and information governance at Microsoft. And Erica and I have known each other for a long time. And I was thinking about the first event we co-organized. I believe it was the SharePoint 2010 launch party that we did with Joel and Owen out in North Seattle there. And then we were also co-organized, I think, 7 or 8 years of the SharePoint Saturday Redmond there in the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington. So it's always great to see a friendly face move from the community over into a Microsoft role. And you've been such a strong community voice on records management and governance, of course, for years. It's great to see you move into this role. So thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I know we were talking before, and you were just going on and on bragging about how you're like the go-to person for not to throw you under the bus. No, but obviously this is a space that you're passionate about, and you have kind of an announcement about a certain work that is now generally available.
Yeah, actually. So as of this morning, my book on Microsoft 365 compliance, published through A-Press, is finally available on the A-Press website, Amazon, in both print and in Kindle ebook. It's my 2020 quarantine project, and basically all I did for the last year. And I wrote it because it was just so hard to find the compliance information. It's kind of scattered across many places. Microsoft Docs isn't the most interesting read. And so I just wrote it to help people.
That's great. Well, I just say, you wrote just the one book last year. I mean, I did 3 books last year, but we can't. I know how big of an effort that is to write a book in the first place. And so it's exciting to see that work out there. So, congrats to you on that, and excited to dig in on the topic.
Thanks. Yeah.
So what's the state of compliance and information governance with Microsoft 365? Kind of where's the focus right now for Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, I think the focus is on growth. Compliance has one of the fastest growing product areas in Microsoft, and that's because really every organization needs some flavor of it. With all the privacy regulations coming out and becoming more strict around the world, it's really not an option anymore to just ignore compliance. And so I think the trick is, you're the M365 admin, you have so much to worry about. How can you really hone in on those things you need to do in your tenant to be compliant?
Right. Well, that's, it's interesting because, again, you and I have, I'm trying to remember if we've co-presented on this. We've been on so many panels and other discussions and things kind of around the broader topic. But, 10 years ago, and we would talk about, people like us would talk about information governance, and you get, and back in the SharePoint side of things, you'd get a lot of devs and IT pros and kind of roll their eyes, but like, do we really need to be focused on this? And I think part of the shift that has just naturally, organically happened is you get more users on the platform. When you're worrying less about keeping servers up and running in the on-prem world, and now just consuming this service and thinking about how are we actually using this technology, using this platform, you now have users who are now thinking about, okay, I am in a regulated industry. I have these compliance, security, governance, compliance rules that I need to live by for my organization. Does the technology actually fit the way that I need to work?
Yeah.
And so you've seen a lot of upgrades, a lot of updates that have happened across the entire stack, the Microsoft 365 platform, around compliance. So what are some of the areas that you're focusing on?
Yeah, so these days I am 100% focused on information governance and records management. That really means is making sure you're retaining content, you're keeping it for when you need to keep it, and deleting it when you don't need it anymore. Sounds simple, but when you're dealing with the insane amount of data that is in Microsoft 365 these days, it can get a little, you need a bit of a plan. How about that?
Yeah. Well, so what is do you have like a preferred methodology or approach for going in there? Where do you point people who are like, where do I even get started? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, so there's really two ways that you can start with retention, depending on whether you're just kind of general organization or if you really need to comply with specific regulations. So number one would be just applying really broad policies. For example, a policy on everybody's email that keeps the email messages for 3 years and then deletes them after 7 years, as an example. And then you can do that, of course, with broad locations like all of SharePoint sites, all of Yammer, etc. And then if you're more highly regulated, that's where you need to get a bit more specific about the categories of information and how long to keep or delete them. So maybe you have contracts, and in your industry vertical, you need to keep contracts for 7 years, and then you want to delete them as fast as possible, because if you need to find them as part of an e-discovery request, because you're being sued, you don't want that information sitting around creating liability.
It's I was just thinking about too some of this with so much focus and energy, excitement around the new announcements around Microsoft Viva, and specifically over on the SharePoint syntax and the topics areas, which are really just kind of an extension of a lot of the things that we've been doing. Obviously, adding a lot to it with the machine learning and the artificial intelligence capabilities to be able to better surface content out of your this knowledge platform. But you have, just the nature of trying to improve the surfacing of this content makes you more aware of, how are we actually governing the content within our system? This kind of, it parallels to what happened as search improved over the lifespan of SharePoint. I remember having an interaction with a customer at a prior company who was talking about, after they had moved over to SharePoint 2010, how search was broken. And what was happening now is that it was surfacing content that it shouldn't be surfacing. And what we identified was, no, actually, it's working properly, or it's improved. And what's happening is it's highlighting the lack of compliance and regulatory controls over your content.
Well, I think that brings up a good related point, which is if you try to do this manually, meaning a human being is going in there, finding the right piece of information, applying the right security policies and protections, and the right retention and governance protections, that's never going to work. And so that's what I think is so exciting about Microsoft's compliance solutions. You can look across your entire environment and then find patterns of information that indicate it should be protected or managed in a certain way.
Well, that's so it's great too if you're proactive about doing that. But the other side of that is organizations that I think it's a huge mistake to think, hey, we just automate everything. So kind of where's the balance there?
Well, I know automation implies completely hands off, but that's not actually true. What it's doing is lessening the amount of work, right? And shortening it and making it more manageable. So a human being is still monitoring it, making adjustments, because it'll never be perfect the first time. You have to run it and test it and adjust it for your organization, and making sure it is working properly.
Well, and part of that too is that, I mean, there's really three places where you can go in and what should be focused on. I mean, there's a lot of vendor solutions, a lot of talk around the provisioning process. So how content enters into the system. I mean, how you actually develop sites and structure that in the first place, which is a lot of automation. So it's not that there's AI and there's bots magically moving data around and doing things to it. It's more of a set it up so that as end users go in, you limit their options to the things which are going to be, relevant and are going to be compliant. And so you're already kind of controlling that process of the entering of information. There's the ongoing management, the second stage. They've entered, now they're in, you're actively managing those things. And I often talk about the community management aspect of, content management, of information governance. And then there is the post, it's the life cycle side of content. And generally organizations, my experience, they will focus on one, maybe two of those areas, but rarely look at each of those three: entering in, active management, life cycle. Where do you see kind of the biggest gaps with users?
I think you articulated the three categories really well. And I think your point that organizations usually focus on one or maybe two of the three is valid. And which ones, it depends, I think, on the organization and what their leadership has said is important and how people have interpreted that. I think of information governance as a journey. You're never going to get to your destination. And oftentimes, in order to do the automation, what the information governance person is doing day to day is kind of looking for clues on how they can automate. Like, if it's this site template, does that imply that I need to use policy A, B, and C? Is it, that site template has a document library and I can key governance off the document library? Like, you find just how you can do it in your organization without disrupting people's work.
Yeah. Well, and I think you kind of inferred too. People often look at this category, this area, as kind of a checklist of things, and they're looking for a document, a guide, and check, I've done that, check, I've done that. But the reality is that your business changes, the rules change, the features and capabilities of the platform change and evolve. And I want to ask you about that. There's lots of announcements that come out with Ignite. We've got Build coming up. There's just a lot that's going on. In fact, I'd say on a weekly basis, there's something that is impacting the platform because of it. The fact that it's a cloud-based platform, and Microsoft is constantly innovating on that. But it is part of this. It needs to be part of your operational activities to constantly be looking at this and saying, is what we have in place good enough? Is it meeting those needs?
Yeah, and this is why I personally was excited to join this space. We're at this interesting point where artificial intelligence and machine learning are becoming mainstream. Like, that's essentially what SharePoint Syntax is. It's machine learning models built into a consumer product that's easy to use. Like, you don't have to understand machine learning to use it. And now you can use that to identify patterns in content and apply sensitivity labels and retention labels to protect that content when those patterns are identified, in addition to the other cool business process stuff you can do with that.
Yeah. And this is an area, I won't get into something specifically, but like last week, there was a discussion because we had the MVP summit last week. And so we got some insights into where some things are going. And out of one of the discussions came the topic, and I believe I CC'd you on it too, of hey, potentially we have a new sensitivity label opportunity here. That's a great example of, especially in this category, if you as a company are using Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, the entire, whatever it is within the stack, and have a requirement that's not being met by the platform, you need to surface that. You need to share that information with Microsoft, because you have people like Erica that are actively in the community, participating on these sites and taking that feedback in and reaching back out, clarifying what is it that you're trying to do. And it could be that there is something that's open in user voice, or it's already on the product roadmap. So there's some digging, some research that you should do before you just go and say, hey, Microsoft, we want this feature. But you should not be shy and share that information out with the community.
I completely agree. I am listening on every social channel, and I purposely have my DMs open on Twitter, my email address published everywhere, because I want people to communicate these pain points or when we're not meeting them. So always happy to listen to your ideas. We take them extremely seriously during the product planning process.
So what's some kind of what are some of the new announcements? What's some of the latest things that are happening with the platform?
Yeah. So first thing is we're continuing to extend the ability to retain and delete content automatically to other Microsoft 365 workloads. So last fall, with the move of the stream recording or Teams meeting recordings to SharePoint and OneDrive, you can now set a separate retention policy for those recordings. We're also adding retention for Yammer as long as it's in native mode, and then Teams private channels and the new Connect channels as well.
That's very cool. And then as far as from the IT pro standpoint, anything that's happening on that way as far as controls, more data reporting, things like that.
Not anything we've announced yet, but it's definitely top of mind for reporting. I think the trick we've found for reporting is it doesn't really work to build pre-canned reports and have them in the compliance center. What we really need to do is just open up the information to be available to Power BI and other tools so people can make reports that make sense for their business. And then, third-party vendors like AvePoint could also create reports that matter for their customers.
That's why I think you see so much content around, like directing IT pros to go and learn about the Microsoft APIs, the Graph API, and to also learn PowerShell. I think between knowing the Graph API and PowerShell, you can pretty much manipulate kind of any aspect of that, and then be able to pull that data in. Well, interesting. So going back a couple steps, we were talking about the provisioning process, and kind of there's a great question. Like, this is a great example of needing to better understand how data is coming into the platform and controlling that. Chuck asked the question, any chance an org will be able to turn off or create new groups in Yammer? I mean, that's just one workload.
Yeah. I would ask the Yammer team that. To be honest, I have no idea about their roadmap. But what you could do is, when those groups are created, you could say, you could take a Teams approach that a lot of people do and say, after 30 days, delete the Yammer messages if you're not using it as a knowledge repository. Or you could even specify maybe some higher risk channels where you don't want that information to be sitting around. And then for things like your executive channels, you can make sure that's kept for forever if you want. Yeah. So that's the type of management we can provide for Yammer specifically.
Well, I know there's a lot of organizations that have concern about just having a free and open collaboration platform, no matter what the workload is, and they want to still have like an IT front door process, so that you request to have a community built, you request to have a SharePoint site or a Teams team. Still hate saying that, a Teams
I
team.
know.
But that you have that process for creating those. You have other organizations that create, now that you can create kind of templates for certainly SharePoint and Teams, so that, yes, you can go in and create, but it's one of 5 approved templates that might have web parts and other tabs and components and things that are part of that. Again, I'm not as familiar with what Yammer has in place, but I know, especially with the move of Dan Holm over from SharePoint OneDrive over into the Yammer world, and Jeff Teeper, for those that don't know, Jeff Teeper, who's the kind of the father of SharePoint and been involved in all these spaces, but also manages Microsoft Teams, and so we have to have consistent experiences across each of these different workloads. Because whether Teams is your front end, or SharePoint, or an Office app like Outlook is your primary front end, how it takes in information, how it manages it actively, how it retains, and the life cycle of that content should be consistent across all those workloads.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And to Chuck's question, creating sites and the ability to do that groups, it's an average person would consider that part of the life cycle. And I think it's a little frustrating to everybody when, you have to go to Yammer to get this piece and the compliance team to understand this piece of the life cycle. And I hope like over time we can work more closely together to have a cohesive end-to-end story on life cycle management. Because I understand that's a little frustrating.
Well, and I think one of the benefits too is not think of of information governance as a checklist, as a document that we go and sign off and we do all these things. I've done it at a couple different companies and I found to be very successful, though it looks rough around the edges when it starts, but is by creating an actual governance body of different key players and having conversations around those things. And those initial meetings are rough. They're 2 to 4 hours long, depending on what you have involved. But when you get that cadence down and you figure out how do we approve, like we want to make this change, we want to, this is how we're going to make changes to the sensitivity labels. Here's how we're going to retain content in these different groups, and have people be able to speak up and like, yes, that makes sense, or no, here's this impact. The manufacturing team, here's the issues that we have. Having those conversations so that people understand the impacts of the decisions that are being made around information governance. I mean, it's just a fantastic thing. It always whittles down. Those meetings become shorter and less frequent as you get more organized, but you can't replace that kind of dialogue, healthy dialogue within a company.
Yeah, you're completely right. And I think it's, recognizing that information is a huge asset to your company. Like this is literally what your everyday people are creating all day, is documents and following processes and taking their ideas and writing them down somewhere. And so, how do you manage that as an asset to be more strategic and have a better competitive advantage? Yeah, it's interesting when you dig into it for sure.
And also the evolution of people's thinking about what should be retained. I mean, 5 years ago, I would say the vast majority of organizations weren't thinking about the chat, the chat messages, the conversations that happen in context to our projects, to our documents, as an information asset that needs to be tracked, that needs to be stored, retained. And so we're seeing a better understanding of that, I think, and new features that have come out. While there's still, there was like just saw a question the end of last week where people were asking about saving, personal chats. Like there's still not a quick and easy way. You and I have a one-on-one chat, but we both agree, or hey, this is something that's important to project XYZ and needs to be retained. There's no way of doing that, automated way of doing that, clicking a button, saving down that chat, and then storing it over in a location. It's a very manual process.
And you can't trigger a flow off a chat. That drives me nuts every day because so much of business at Microsoft is done in Teams, and people send you something important in a chat instead of a Teams channel. The only thing you can do is bookmark it. Yeah. Or email it to yourself and create a task from that email.
Well, that's why I love the things, yes, and being able to trigger and better automate some of those activities, especially if it's seeing that on a regular, consistent basis. But you have features like the share from Outlook to Teams, share it from Teams to Outlook, and you're going to see, I made an observation too with the product teams last week during the MVP summit, was that I think my observation is that the more that we've seen the integration between, and this was with the Yammer team, with Yammer and Teams and SharePoint. And some people are like, well, why do I need Yammer if I have Teams doing that? There's very different scenarios, very different use cases there. And what's actually happening is that Microsoft, and I'm not going to jump in, I don't know if announcements are going to be made around it. So what I could say is that Yammer usage is going way up. It's increasing. So it's rising faster than other products that would surprise you. And so it's great to see that, that as it's being more tightly integrated in. And let me just throw this out there for those that were, and I know Erica, you were a Yammer fan prior to the acquisition by Microsoft. So going way back, for those of us that are in this space, we've been, since day one of that acquisition of Yammer, I don't know how many years ago that was, we've been wanting to see this kind of integration in. So it's great to see that it's happening, that it's becoming kind of a first tier experience truly within information management, but that you're seeing now growth of the platform as people. Tighter integration has actually helped people. I'm soapboxing, I know, but tighter integration is actually increasing people's understanding of the value that Yammer brings. So, yeah. Anyway.
Well, I think that and COVID.
Yeah, and COVID. Yeah.
I mean, are people really going to be able to ever go back to how we worked before or after this? No. Even if you go back to the office, people are still going to want to connect with their coworkers and, people in other offices using technology. And they've seen like how much faster you can do work and, even better and more accurate in some cases, by kind of relying on the web a bit more rather than just being physically in a location.
There've been some arguments that have been happening about what's going to happen post COVID and going back. And I agree with you. And I had this thought too. So I did martial arts for a number of years, and you're trained on 50 different ways to defend yourself. You really only need, when it comes to the moment, to remember one of those ways to defend yourself out of that. And to some degree, all this technology is like, even if your company believes in being all in one location, you go back to that model. You can't. To your point, things have changed, and the way that you interact, even sitting in the same physical location, is going to be different because of what we've experienced and because of this leap in the features and capabilities of the platforms we use.
Well, I think there's also been some cultural changes that have happened in addition to technology. Like, there's been a very big focus on being inclusive, that's permeated our culture in many ways. And so, what technology allows you to do is more people can participate. Even if they're not comfortable speaking up in a meeting in front of 30 people, they would be comfortable making a post in a group of 30 people. So it's just, I think, interesting all around.
Well, there's a lot that's happening. Any other kind of final points? Anything else that people should be aware of what's been happening in the records management and information governance space?
I'll just kind of do a teaser. The first week of May, so a month from now, we're going to have some really big announcements in the information governance and record space. So we'll be posting, in the usual places like the tech community blog, social media. But if you're interested in this space, stay tuned. Awesome.
Well, Erica, really appreciate your time today. I know that really it's great to have you and dig into this, and as I participate in some of the partner community activities, so I'm excited to learn more, hear more about this. Some of the announcements that we heard last week as they start to roll out, for that news to hit as well. And for people to go and find your book, where can they find it?
Apress.com and Amazon. Search for Microsoft 365 Compliance.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for your time today. Thanks for everybody who's been watching on the live stream as well, and for the handful of questions that have come in. Again, continue asking the questions out, even if you find this recording weeks later. Post them out to LinkedIn. I would say go and search on the AvePoint page and find the office hours recordings. Of course, you can reach out, as Erica said. So she's wide open to the community out there. So you can find her, you can DM her, ask questions, and always great to see you and talk to you. And thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.